We're here today to talk about one of the most extraordinary efforts underway globally, involving tens of thousands of Sudanese civilians who are at the forefront of initiatives to save people, to end the fighting, and to protect civilians, brave, determined.
I'm working on my lip syncing. Did I do a good job? No. Not bad, right? No? No! But seriously, the initiatives that lady was referring to are the emergency response rooms of Sudan, a network of hundreds of volunteer-led and operated groups that have provided life-saving assistance to communities across the country over the last year and 10 months of war. If you watched episode 1, you kind of know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I'm kidding. Go watch it. Residents of the capital Khartoum were jolted awake on the morning of April 15th, 2023 to the sounds of heavy gunfire. A lot of people dismissed it, just sort of like a side effect of living in a politically charged and heavily militarized climate. What they didn't know was that clashes were underway between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces further north in Medawi, and that things were about to get a lot worse in Khartoum. Things escalated quickly in the capital, from gunfire to bombs and soon airstrikes. People took cover in their homes, but once they realized the severity of the situation, they made plans to escape with their lives. At the same time, groups of volunteers were coming together in neighborhoods and organizing into teams with the leadership of the resistance committees. Now, by the end of this first week of war, they would be known as the emergency response rooms, or ERRs for short. The ERRs sprang into action, providing emergency medical care to injured people, devising evacuation plans, and live reporting the events that were unfolding. See, at the time, these reports that were shared on their various social media platforms were the only way for folks inside and outside Sudan to know what was happening. These reports were integral for local and diaspora families who are looking to evacuate their loved ones from Khartoum. And not just them. Some foreign missions and humanitarian organizations who are scrambling to evacuate their staff also relied on the emergency response rooms, volunteers, civilians, to get them through the minefield of a city to their various evacuation points. By the end of April, the zone of conflict had grown considerably, spreading to central and western Sudan, and there too, emergency response rooms were very quickly formed. As the months dragged on, the fighting grew more intense and the violence more direct, more personal, from bombing and airstrikes to home raids, mass looting, summary executions, and sexual assault. This meant the scale and specificity of aid had also changed. But by this time, most of the aid organizations had evacuated out of the conflict zones to safer areas across the country or out of the country altogether. In the absence of specialized aid agencies or a functioning local government, ERRs in the conflict zones found themselves taking on the burden of the humanitarian response. So they had to organize. Within the structure of each response room are several subunits or teams, each handling a specific aspect of the response. So you have a medical team, a procurement team, a team that runs the shelters and the community kitchens, and so on. This level of organization needed to happen, and fast. We're talking about over 1 million people internally displaced in 30 days of war, and more than 11 million at the time of this recording. Over half the Sudanese population is now in urgent need of humanitarian assistance, and famine has been declared in more than one part of the country. All of this, and not a single ceasefire has been respected this entire time. ERRs across the country have found themselves not only responsible for their distraught and traumatized communities, but also for thousands of displaced people who are fleeing violence in their homes, sometimes with just the clothes on their backs. So, schools, dormitories, mosques, neighborhood squares, empty plots of land, all have been turned into makeshift shelters and displacement camps. Community kitchens were established with volunteers, sometimes the displaced people themselves, taking on the task of preparing and distributing the daily meals to sustain thousands of people in need. Emergency response room volunteers have also served as support staff or main staff at hospitals and clinics. They've been EMTs, emergency transport for the sick and injured. They've even been responsible for securing fuel for hospital generators. Female volunteers have played a unique role, heading up subunits units that tend to the needs of women and children, but also that support victims of sexual violence, one of the most tragic and most pervasive aspects of this war. Access to healthcare has been so difficult, with over 80% of hospitals and healthcare facilities in the conflict zones completely out of commission. And even if these facilities are available, freedom of movement isn't, and transportation even less so. So emergency response rooms have created roaming field clinics that visit neighborhoods, shelters, and displacement camps, not just to provide care, but to also assess, report on, and document the physical and mental health toll that this war has had. And that toll has been massive. In the last 20 months of war, death has been copious and complicated. The scale and volume of it so great, it cannot be quantified. Literally, we don't know how many people have died. And the intensity of fighting combined with the urban warfare nature of this conflict means that people are dying everywhere. In their homes, in hospitals, in markets, on the side of the road. And the endless raids and threat of roaming militants means that their families can't even lay them to rest without risking their lives themselves. So emergency response room volunteers have taken on that task, braving the dangers to give the deceased proper burial. The prevalence of death has also created a massive public health crisis, one which the emergency response rooms are combating through their environmental intervention teams that not only deal with the bodies, but also the various other burgeoning or worsening environmental crises that have been brought about by this war. If I were to list all of the ways that emergency response rooms have tended to communities over the last year and 10 months, this video would be at least an hour long. With their decentralized structure, the ERRs have essentially become a safety net that is spread across the country. It covers state, locality, and community. It's a network that, to quote the experts,
models the democratic and people-centered process that the Sudanese people crave.
And with each new development, this network has skillfully pivoted to accommodate, modifying activities and recalibrating their modes of operation to fit the needs of the moment. The level of efficiency, efficacy, and flexibility with which the emergency response rooms operate deserves to be studied, and is actually. This feat that the emergency response rooms have achieved and sustained, mind you, is so great that they have been lauded as a possible new mode of humanitarian response in conflict zones, and has landed them a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. Yeah, a Nobel. But here's the thing. We've been talking about all the ways that the emergency response rooms have been keeping communities alive over the last year and 10 months of war, which, yes, facts. But what I'm afraid of is that the reality will inadvertently get lost in the sauce of heroism or muted by the rosy tint of resilience that is so often painted on folks who look like me at the expense of our humanity. Because while, yes, we are resilient, at the end of the day, this work is being done by people, volunteers, regular civilians who have been through and continue to go through indescribable hardship. They've lost their homes, their loved ones, their possessions, their livelihoods. And yeah, these are people whom the Sudanese have come to rely on for aid. Consider the story of Noor, a volunteer with the Khartoum Emergency Response Room Sexual Violence Unit, who, during the course of her work, found herself tending to her own sisters who had been raped. And there are so many other stories like Noor's, countless stories of immense personal tragedy and loss that these volunteers have had to just swallow and suppress for the sake of collective survival. I don't want you to consider these volunteers in a vacuum, and I don't want you to consider them separate from the Sudanese population, because they're not. They're experiencing the same things, and they also represent that population. They run the ethnic, tribal, socioeconomic, and political gamut of Sudan. They're not held back by gender or geography. None of these labels matter. They transcend all of it. They are people who are balancing personal and national loss by calling upon custom and tradition. They're propelled by a deep sense of love and belonging to Sudan and a duty to save what's left of their communities and of their country. These volunteers have taken on an extraordinary mission, one with so many risks and so many challenges. But we'll have to wait for the next episode to get into that.